Let's see. Okay.
Actually, the last thing I asked was if you had known about any tests that were done.
Not explicitly. I'm not an evolutionary biologist. I've just looked into some of it. But remember, I was telling you earlier about the fact that in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, there was a theory that came out called sociobiology.
Yeah.
Sociobiology was written by a couple of guys. One of them was an entomologist who had worked with a postdoc fellow who was studying primates.
Okay.
And he was mainly an ant guy, and he worked with a guy who was studying monkeys. And he saw that monkeys were having a lot of the same social qualities that ants were having. And so what he came up with was a theory of biology which took into account social aspects.
Okay.
And I don't know all there is to know about social biology or how it affects evolution, but the thing is, that changed a lot of things, even in psychology and sociology, who at the time believed that people were a blank slate, that there were no instincts.
Huh.
Now we have the whole nature versus nurture thing because of this. Science is constantly changing. Evolution is one theory in science that changes all the time. Sociology is, at least the people who really go into it, are real scientists who try to use that method. There's also psych people who look in the human mind and how it works, and they're changing things probably more rapidly than anybody else, except maybe quantum physicists. And so science is constantly changing. Like you said, if they're shown evidence that will say this is wrong, that this theory isn't correct because of this, they'll revise their theories. Because to them what matters is understanding the what and the how. When you were talking about gravity, Newtonian gravity wasn't thrown out. It was just realized that it was only covering a small scale. Even Newton never figured out why this stuff was happening. He came up with an equation for what was happening.
Okay.
Gravity did this. And this is the equation that explains what gravity does and how it works. He never came up with the whole mechanism, the whole larger how of the mechanism behind why gravity worked. Well, I said that scientists don't care about the why. What I mean is they don't care about the why in terms of why are we here, why is, they
like
care
existential
about,
questions and
abstracts,
abstracts,
they care about the
basically.
existential and abstracts. They care about the how in terms of the larger scheme of how it all works and how it all fits and the mechanisms behind how everything works. And so that was what general relativity gave, was the mechanism for how gravity actually worked. What was the underlying mechanism behind gravity, behind how it worked. So that's how that changed. But with evolution, we're only now, in the past 20 years or so, really beginning to understand the how behind evolution.
Okay.
Because we understood the what for a while. We understood change over time, blah, blah, blah. We never understood the how, really. Until we started cataloging the human genome and all that stuff like that, and really started to understand DNA and genetics and all that stuff like that, did we start to understand how this stuff worked. And even now, we're only really starting to come into it, maybe in the past decade, past half-decade even. They have come up with this thing that they're starting to get into now, which is called the metagenome. And evidently, you've got your DNA, and they go into your chromosomes. But there are proteins that wrap around your various chromosomes, which activate portions of those chromosomes, or portions of your DNA, based on traits. You've got, for instance, the eye color genes from both your parents, and possibly your grandparents.
Yeah.
But only one of those gets activated. Only one of those sequences of DNA gets activated, and these proteins are what activate those things. They activate this one and don't activate the other ones. That's your metagenome. And those proteins, as to what they activate and things like that, are vital to understanding how come people get How come some people get diabetes and others don't when they have the same genes, and things like that? How come identical twins one can have a crippling illness and one not when they have the exact same genes? That's because of their metagenome, which is, as they're finding, extremely dependent on environmental factors, on changes in your environment, not just to the individual, but they're finding back 2 generations. They're actually finding that they've actually done several studies where they have found that people who, like grandparents who were in a famine when they were kids, will pass on to their grandkids traits that will determine whether or not they'll be more inclined to have diabetes.
Grandparents.
And those grandkids can lead perfectly good lives in terms of their various dietary habits. They can not be at risk for anything personally that they've done, but because their grandparents were in a famine when they were a kid, or were in a time of plenty when they were a kid, depending on gender and when it happened, and that's all dependent, by the way, as they're finding, on when the reproductive cells were made. For males, their reproductive cells aren't made until they're in their preteens, and for females, they're made when they're in the womb.
Yeah.
And so this is where you get a mechanism for genetic change directly from environmental factors.
Wouldn't that also happen to point to evolution? Because part of the reason why they say evolution works and why a species might change a bit over time is because of environmental factors. And because remember, we all live on the planet. People always like separating themselves from the animal kingdom, but we all work the same way, in that depending on certain environmental factors, we will adapt. The guy in the Matrix, Smith in the Matrix, was wrong. Human beings do interact and have a vibration with their planet. This thing just proved it about the fact that, and I remember what you were talking about, because remember that show you were telling me when they were talking about how grandparents, depending on whether they're living in a time of plenty or living in a time of famine, they would develop certain genes that would be passed on to their children and their grandchildren, but it's the environmental factors that cause this to happen.
It wouldn't even be in their genes, it would be in their metagenes, which are in their sex cells, their reproductive cells. So this is a whole other aspect of genetic change that we didn't know about a decade ago, or we were beginning to suspect, but we didn't have any tests, we didn't have any evidence yet. And now we're beginning to gather evidence about this. And the whole thing that I've seen people say that the gene pool can't have any new information added into it. Well, that's obviously false. It can and it does. And if you want to look at another thing, look at the Hiroshima people, or look at the people who lived in Alamogordo back during the war. Their descendants all have most of them seem to have a greatly increased chance of cancer of various sorts. Why? Because their grandparents were nuked.